Thank you very much. Why robots won't be doctors ever? So I've been trying to engage with this fourth industrial revolution conversation. It relates to a couple of things I've already worked on. So one is causation, causal inference, and I've been working on that really throughout my whole sort of career since the middle of my doctorate. And the other, more recently, is medicine. And one of the things that gets said is that robots are going to replace doctors. Doctors is a job that's at risk of being automated. And I don't think that's true. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to consider the things that doctors are supposed to be worse at than potential robots and even some actual robots. I'm going to argue that in general such predictions are false. Predictions of this kind that project great success for future developments of current technology, or even just for future technology that we hope will happen but hasn't yet. I'm going to argue specifically, so that's a kind of second order argument. I'm going to argue that specifically these predictions are false. There are good reasons to think these particular ones are false. And this is where the stuff on causation comes in. So you've got to be able to describe a way of reasoning in order to get a machine to do it. You've got to be able to say what it is you want the machine to do and then tell it to do those things. Otherwise, it won't be able to. This hasn't been done with causation and with causal thinking. We can't say what causation is, and we can't say what it is to reason causally. Being a doctor requires causal thinking. Doctors have to think causally to be doctors, and therefore robots can't be doctors. That's the argument that I'm going to use there. I'm going to consider an objection that actually that's false, and that one day robots will be doctors, even if at the moment, given the current state of the art, they can't. And then I'm going to close with an argument that regardless of the use of causal reasoning, there are still things that doctors can do that do relate to causal reasoning, but in a different way, that robots can't. Specifically, robots won't be able to understand stuff, and understanding stuff is something that's necessary for medicine. Okay. Anything doctors can do, machines can do better. So this is a cover of, I think Henny lent me this, is that correct? This is the cover of the National Geographic, as it was in January. And it has a whole thing in there about the future of medicine. So I've given you, by the way, handouts which have, there may not have been enough, but the notes are kind of where there's other things that I don't think it's helpful to cram onto the slide. But this has a whole load of stuff in there about phrases like precision medicine. Obviously, gene gets thrown around. Sensors. What else? There's basically a whole load of claims about what medicine's going to be able to do. And then to forestall potential criticism, they throw something in there about sort of different traditions, traditional medicine as well, even though it's just very obvious that's an afterthought. And they're trying to sort of, they're trying to cover up. It's a very old story. Technology is going to take us to the moon, we'll be living on the moon, and so forth. And that's what people thought in the 60s. And in fact, technology stayed at exactly that level until now, basically. At exactly the level it was when people made those predictions. Space technology did, and different technologies developed instead. But there are some things that doctors do better than machines do better than doctors, or could, quite plausibly. It's plausible they could be more accurate because we are limited by our senses and by our reasoning capacities. It is plausible they could avoid bias because you could program a machine to be biased, but you could also not. And bias is basically the consideration of factors that are irrelevant to the outcome of interest, or potentially also surreptitiously holding a different outcome to be of interest. And so machines could be better at this. We all harbor bias. There's implicit bias in all of us. It's deeply hardwired into how we get around the world. Machines not so. Consistency. They've done some alarming, there's some alarming evidence on this, which is this is one of the things that gets used to say doctors could be replaced by robots. You take a bunch of scans and you show them of some kind or other, like whether it's readouts from X-rays or something like that, and you show a bunch of expert doctors and you ask them to make diagnoses, and you do it again with the same scans with the same doctors, and they'll make different diagnoses for quite a lot of the scans. So, presumably only one of those diagnoses can be correct, and so they must be making some mistakes. And not only are they making mistakes, the mistakes they're making are not consistent. And that matters because how consistent your mistakes are is relevant to how easy it is to fix them. You know, if anybody's done any archery or something or shooting, the first thing you do is you try and get your grouping of hits on the target small, and then you adjust your sight so that small thing is onto the target. But if your pattern is like this, then it doesn't matter if you occasionally hit the target. You're going to be all over the place. And it seems like for at least some sorts of things, like reading a scan or something, machines are have a much closer grouping, as it were, than human doctors. Eating and sleeping less. You know, we have this problem that we like to sleep and eat and take time off, chat, and whatever. Avoiding mistakes. It's not that machines can't make mistakes. It's just that arguably they would be less likely to because of the fact that they don't get distracted and things like that. Computers very rarely make mistakes with arithmetic, with things they can do. And if they do, it's usually an obvious thing, like the whole thing goes haywire. So you can usually spot a mistake, and a computer won't hide its mistake. You know, and in medicine, it's very common to hide mistakes. You know, if you know anybody who works in medicine or in surgery or something like that, you know, patients die because of complications. I mean, that's often as not that's a medical error, but they're not going to say that to you, obviously, because then you'll sue. And people won't admit their mistakes for obvious reasons. Whereas you could tell if a machine made a mistake. People are not very good at learning. Not grown-ups, actually. I mean, children maybe, but grown-ups are not very good at learning. We resist it actively. If I tell you something that you don't believe, you're not likely to change your mind and believe me. You're much more likely to find reasons to think to explain why I'm wrong. Confirmation bias is part of is what this is sometimes called. So we tend to look for reasons to support our beliefs and not to look for reasons that we're wrong, and to believe things that would tend to support our beliefs and not to believe things that would tend to disagree. And sometimes we just, we might just not hear about stuff. So this relates to updating practice. One of the issues that medicine as a whole has is that guidelines get released. This is an era of guidelines which kind of expects doctors to act a bit like robots and follow a guideline, follow a set course of making a decision. And doctors either don't know about them, they haven't checked their emails, whatever it might be, and so they don't do what the latest thing is. If you had machines, you could just change the guidelines. You could just adjust a central thing, and all the machines around the world that were connected to this network would start doing the latest best practice. It takes much longer to train even a willing human to do that. Okay, so these are all reasons to think that doctors might be replaced by robots in at least many, many core functions. Perhaps you could even train machines to be nicer than doctors, because doctors aren't always very nice. Though there are many nice doctors, in case anybody here is a doctor. So the first point I want to make about it is that predictions of this optimistic nature, we're going to live on the moon, doctors are going to become robots, everyone's going to have their own self-driving, flying car, we'll all be down to a one-day work week, and even that we can do from bed. I mean, all of that stuff, it's not new, and most such predictions are false. Not only those very positive ones, but generally large-scale political, socioeconomic predictions. So there's a guy called Philip Tetlock who's a psychologist, and I really recommend looking at some of his stuff. Expert Political Judgment is the book that is kind of, I think, made his name, but he's co-authored with a guy called Daniel Gardner, who's a popular science writer. Daniel Gardner wrote a book called Future Babble, and then there's another book more recently called Super Forecasting. And I don't really know why this stuff hasn't connected up with the Fourth Industrial Revolution stuff yet, because they're closely related in a number of ways. But Tetlock says, he's done a long study of prediction over like 20 years or more, and he asks people, loads of people, questions like, when will the Soviet Union fall, back before it fell? Will any more states leave the EU in the next 2 years? Will there be further bombing of Syria? Or things like this, more or less fine-grained. And then he waits for the relevant events and scores how accurate the various predictions are with some sort of predetermined scoring. Difficult thing to do, but he's done it with a very large amount of data, which makes it plausible. And unfortunately, he's found a number of things that you might think are correlated with predictive success are not at all correlated with predictive success. Professional background. That means that if you are, say, an expert in political science, your predictions about political science, the future of politics, are not more likely to be true than anybody else's. If you are a doctor, your predictions about medicine are not more likely to be true than anybody else's. Access to classified information, access to state secrets, doesn't make a difference, statistically speaking. Whether you have a doctorate in the relevant domain doesn't make a difference. You could have a doctorate in artificial intelligence and then make predictions about the future of artificial intelligence, and they could be false. You could have a doctorate in economics and make predictions about the future of the economy, and they are just as likely to be false as if you didn't have a doctorate. In economics, this was demonstrated in a dramatic way in 2008, leading to a considerable a change in the discipline, which is probably only going to fully realize when the current generation of big shots sort of dies out. But people in the lower, I was talking to an economist yesterday, people coming through are doing a totally different kind of economics. They're not doing as much theory, basically, modeling. Because of 2008, and because all this stuff that they thought they were doing, describing these general laws that had general applicability, just turned out that that's not what they were doing. They were wrong. Years of professional experience, again. So I'm not more likely to be right about stuff now than I was when I was 25, and my 60-year-old self isn't more likely to be right than I am now either. How many years of experience you've got in the game doesn't matter. Political orientation. If you're thinking, well, those like Republicans are obviously wrong about what'll happen if you build a wall, and if the Republicans are thinking, well, those liberals are obviously wrong about if you build a wall between USA and Mexico, it doesn't make actually a difference whether you're left or right. It's not like left-wingers or right-wingers are more accurate. What makes a difference are cognitive styles, according to Tetlock. Now, perhaps he's biased because he's a psychologist, but maybe there's other things. But he says there's a cognitive style of being a fox and of being a hedgehog. A fox has lots of different ideas, so there's a fable by Aesop, which is then picked up by Isaiah Berlin, who's a philosopher in the early 20th century. And Isaiah Berlin says, look, there are basically two kinds of thinkers. There's the fox and the hedgehog. The fox has lots of different ideas, which they're always experimenting with. They change their views a lot. And the hedgehog doesn't. The hedgehog has one idea and they're sticking to it. They see the world through the lens of that idea. If somebody is, for example, a Marxist, and they will tell you they're a Marxist, they're a hedgehog. If somebody is like unsure, and they'll say, yeah, but I kind of, well, look, I mean, say feminism is, I don't know if I'm a feminist because, well, yeah, I do believe in this, but I'm not sure, but then they're probably a fox. So the idea is that foxes are better at predicting than hedgehogs. Now, they're not that good. Prediction's hard. They're still not very good at it, but they're better than people who have a clear idea. So there's a pecking order. Foxes are at the top, Then it's dart throwing chimps. It's random. And then, worse than random is the hedgehog. Worse than random. You're better off flipping a coin. So, if you go and ask Professor Kate Alexander, for example, what's going to happen to the economy, you'd be better off flipping a coin, according to Philip Tetlock. Not according to me, according to Philip Tetlock. As the Dean of Humanities, I would never say that. So I put, this is stupid, but I put this little equation. Accuracy is inversely related to traction. So the issue is that accuracy goes down this way. Fox, random, hedgehog. Actually, in between here, I left out is basic prediction algorithms. Basic algorithms saying what's going to happen. Like, for example, with predicting the weather, there is a basic algorithm called persistence forecasting, which says tomorrow the weather's going to be the same as today. And this basic algorithm performs pretty well compared to much more complex, expensive algorithms. So if you don't have a weather forecast and you want to know what the weather's going to do tomorrow, you've got a decent bet that it's going to, a better than random chance of just saying, well, it's going to do what it did today. But that's a basic prediction algorithm. Foxes do better than those. Chimps, dart-throwing chimps, random, is the kind of baseline. Hedgehogs, worse than random. None of them is very good, by the way. Obviously, we're not very good at predicting. The trouble is that as accuracy reduces, traction increases. So, sorry, I've done this. The arrows are confusing me because I've done the arrow going in the descending order. So the descending order here is upwards, you see. Hedgehogs get the most traction. By that I mean that people listen to them. A hedgehog has a clear stance. A fox doesn't. So if you ask a fox what's going to happen, will dogs be replaced by robots? They'll say, I don't know. It depends a bit. I'm not too sure. If you ask a hedgehog, they'll say, yes, computing power doubles every 18 months, blah, 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 blah. You might think I'm proving myself wrong here because I'm saying no, but I'm just pretending. I'm just pretending for the purpose of the talk to be a hedgehog. I'm not really. It's actually interesting that there are, I think, good reasons that there are different advantages to these different cognitive styles. And if you didn't have people who pushed ideas hard, then arguably we wouldn't get so far in academic life and in developing our ideas. So I'm not as hard on hedgehogs as Tetlock is. But for prediction, for predictive purposes, if you're thinking in this way, your chances of being wrong are quite high. But your chances of getting an audience are also quite high because what you say is clear. People understand it. You're confident. You seem to have an answer. You're a good debater because you're not interested in changing your views. And when your opponent says something, your entire mental energy is focused on proving them wrong, not on trying to reevaluate your own beliefs to see if what they've just said makes a difference. So these guys make good pundits. They're on TV. They get to run countries. Either people like this or people who at least talk like this in public, which has the same effect. And the way we organize our political system is around these unitary political parties that just have a sort of an answer for everything. You don't get far if you sort of say, well, Hoover's one-handed economist is what gets traction. So there's a general reason to think predictions of this kind aren't wrong. These particular predictions are false. So this is well, I don't think it's too complex. To implement a cognitive capacity, you've got to be able to describe it, to mathematize it, in the word of Judea Pearl, who's an expert on this stuff. Causal thinking has not been mathematized. We can't say, we can't express causal thinking in equations. Being a doctor requires causal thinking, and doctoring, therefore, can't be implemented by a machine. You can't implement the cognitive capacity of being a doctor that doctors have, and all their cognitive capacities in a machine. And I think this is, or at least can easily be developed into a valid argument, so I want to assess the premises, one in each in turn. So, to implement you've got to mathematize, or at least describe. I think this is fairly obvious. To implement something on a computer, to program a computer, you've got to be able to express what it is you want it to do, express it explicitly and unambiguously. Computers can't tolerate ambiguity, and if you've ever done any coding, one of the things you've got to do is kind of spell things out in a way that you would never normally do. We follow each other in natural discussion. Computers don't follow us. Often we don't follow them. So I take it that's pretty clear, with one caveat that I'll come to later. Causal thinking hasn't been mathematized, and I'm going to go into this in little detail. If you don't follow this, it's okay. You can just believe me. Because I have the necessary confidence and authority which correlates with predictive success. So I was trying to think how to, what is causation? I mean, it's when one thing makes another thing happen. I think perhaps the neatest way of characterizing it is to say it's asymmetric necessitation. So C makes E happen. So there's some sort of necessity. Given that C happens, E has to happen in some sense or other of has to happen, but not the other way around. Effects don't make their causes happen. So it's a bit confusing because necessitates renders necessary, which actually means is sufficient for. So sorry, that's just how the words, so it just gets a bit confusing with the necessary and the sufficients, but that's the way it works, that's what it means. Necessitation means makes happen, which means in some sense is sufficient for. Ned Hall in 2004 has a paper that hasn't been discussed that much, but he distinguishes two notions of causation, and I think it's a useful distinction, which is production and counterfactual dependence. The production notion is C making E happen, C produces E. There's energy transfer, the one billiard ball bashes into the other. It's the notion of a push or of leaving a mark. There's theories of causation based on all of these notions. There's some notion of sufficiency here, of necessitation, of the one thing making the other happen. There's another notion which is counterfactual dependence, and that is if the cause hadn't happened, the effect wouldn't have happened. So, for example, if I hadn't struck the match, it wouldn't have lit, and that's what it is. The idea goes for C to cause E. And what's happened, of course, is that philosophers have tried to pick on one notion and explain the whole of causality with it. And Hall's idea is that within the notion of causation, forget what it actually is in the world for now, within the notion we've actually got two different notions, and these come into play in different cases. And that perhaps explains some of the paradoxes. I'm attracted to that idea. Whether it's correct or not, I don't know. Note there's a difference here, because on this one, production C is somehow sufficient for E, and on this one, it's somehow necessary. If C hadn't happened, E wouldn't have happened. If the cause hadn't happened, the effect wouldn't have happened, meaning that in some situation, the cause was necessary in some way for the effect. If the, without the match strike, the fire wouldn't have happened. The match wouldn't have lit. So a counterfactual theory of causation, then, if somebody comes along and picks the counterfactual and tries to make a theory of causation out of it, goes something like this. C causes E if, not if and only if, just if. If C were not to happen, then E would not happen. So, for example, if I had not struck the match, it would not have lit. And this means that what that makes this a theory of causation is that this means that or implies that striking the match causes it to light. So the notion, I think there is, in fact, and was a huge intellectual event. I actually think it's possibly the intellectual event of our times, still ongoing, more important than the human genome or something, which is the explosion of thinking about counterfactuals and causation, the counterfactual revolution. Judea Pearl talks about the causal revolution. I actually think it's a counterfactual revolution. People have thought about causes for years. However, in recent times, there's been a counterfactual revolution. By way of background, there was, in Western thought, for a long time, a dominance of a notion of causation that came from Aristotle. This notion of causation was based on the idea that things belonged somewhere and that there was a natural order, and things tended towards that natural order and to the place where they belonged. Heavy things belong low down, and that's why they fall. He also had views about circularity being spiritually, divine and so forth, and that's why the planets go in a circle and so forth. I mean, the spheres, the crystal spheres that he thought were around the Earth. I'm sorry, I don't mean Aristotle, I mean Aristotelian thinkers, scholastics. In the scientific revolution, one way or another, this was dumped. And it's very complex, I'm simplifying. But you can see this in Newton, who has symmetrical laws describing mathematical relationships between quantities. You can rearrange those quantities. There's nothing really there about where things belong. Obviously, there are various instances of that, like the fact that heavy objects don't actually fall faster than light ones. But that's the fundamental thing, that there's just nothing. It's not that things are tending towards something. That's just not apparent in Newton's physics. Darwin, and the reason Darwin is so significant is that he removed teleology. He removed purpose from biology. So it's very natural to explain biological facts by the function, by the purpose they serve, by the function they fulfill. The polar bear is white because seals can't see the polar bear, and that means the polar bear has an easier time hunting the seals. Darwin comes along and says, no, you don't need that notion of purpose, because the reason the polar bear is white is actually there were loads of polar bears, and these ones, the white ones, survived because they got to eat more seals. So it takes the notion of purpose entirely out of biology. Of course, that has big religious implications as well. David Hume sought to develop a notion of causation that accommodated Newton's physics. And his idea was that causation is a regularity. It's one thing, then another. So it's simply one thing happening and then another, but all the time. So causes are simply things that are always followed by certain other things. Striking the match is always followed by the match lighting. That's his idea. And that's the difference between a cause and a coincidence. If I sort of scratch my head and the match lights, okay, that's a succession in that instance, but another time I scratch my head and the match doesn't light. So because it's not part of this long succession, you can tell that it's not a causation in this instance. That's his view. And this has various consequences. If there isn't this sort of natural order where things belong, we can't just intuit things. So that's what makes Hume an empiricist. You need experience to learn causal facts. And our concept of, and this is going into Hume, our concept of causation is just a kind of shadow of the feeling we get when we see a cause and expect the effect. That doesn't really matter for these purposes. Then along come the 1970s. I mean, this is history for philosophers. It doesn't have to be very accurate. And it's really remarkable. Within 4 years, you get a number of different contributions in economics, philosophy, and statistics. I don't know about artificial intelligence. I'm still looking into this. But they're saying remarkably similar things. And they're saying basically that we should consider, when we're trying to understand or express causal facts, the idea that if the cause hadn't happened, the effect wouldn't have happened. Then it's kind of quiet through the 80s and the 90s. There is a lot of talk about causation, but it's not really getting anywhere in a sense. And then again in the 2000s, it explodes. The year 2000, you have two famous books. This one by Pearl is the most famous. I don't know if it's justified, but it is. And people are suddenly talking about counterfactuals and causation across a range of disciplines: epidemiology, statistics, law. Well, no, not law. Let me leave law out of it. epidemiology, statistics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is where Pearl is, and these guys. Philosophy again. And basically across the social sciences, any discipline that has to deal with statistics. So very much statistics driven. So just to compare these two notions, just again, C events, the regularity idea is that C events are always followed by E events. It renders causes sufficient, not necessary. It's symmetric, and as a consequence with that, it struggles to capture the difference between cause and effect. So there's a regularity between cause and effect, but there's also one between effect and cause in many cases. And there's often a regularity between two effects of a common cause. So the barometer, or say the thermometer falls and the temperature falls. Or the barometer falls and there's a storm. Well, the barometer falling is a consequence of the air pressure falling, which also causes the storm. But if you want to avoid a storm, you can't just adjust the needle of the barometer. And regularity theories have a great deal of difficulty capturing that fact and capturing the fact that the correlation between the barometer falling and the storm is somehow importantly different from the correlation between the air pressure falling and the storm. And thus it struggles to provide a sufficient condition for causation. Counterfactual idea is that if the cause were not to happen, the effect would not happen. Renders causes in some sense necessary rather than sufficient. It is asymmetric, and thus it does capture what I was talking about now quite well. If the barometer had not fallen, the storm would still have occurred. The barometer would have been broken, basically, is the idea. But it struggles with some other things. What about cases where there's no physical contact between the two things, but the counterfactual holds true? What about cases where an absence appears to be causal? If I hadn't, I don't water the plants and the plants die. If I had watered the plants, they would have lived. But it seems weird to say that my failure to do something, the absence of something, caused an event, namely the plants dying. Some think that's a problem. It struggles in particular with redundancy, which I will explain in a moment. So, going back to the thread, causal thinking hasn't been mathematized. It hasn't been described in any way, mathematically or not. There are two reasons I want to press, one popular and one not. Causal redundancy. So if ESCOM does what it commonly does and fails, the lights in the Vice-Chancellor's office will stay on because we have a generator. It doesn't power the whole university, but it powers various places, including the Vice-Chancellor's office. Not mine, the Vice-Chancellor's. But in fact, the grid is on, powering the lights in the Vice-Chancellor's office. So it's not the case that there's a counterfactual dependence. It's not the case that if the grid went down, the lights would go off. That's false, because if the grid went down, the lights would still be on because of the generator. This is a big problem for counterfactual theories of causation because it's fundamental. The fundamental claim is that if the cause hadn't happened, the effect wouldn't have happened. But there's an important class of cases for which that's just not true. Not only that, but we make use of this fact all the time. We build generators precisely, but we exploit this feature of causation to make sure that we have, it's a plan B. The notion of a plan B shows that the counterfactual theory is fundamentally flawed. So despite it being very attractive and natural to think that there's a close connection between counterfactuals and causation, there's also a very obvious problem with that thought. And there have been all sorts of very clever attempts to deal with this problem, and they are all wrong. There will be somebody who will disagree with that statement for each of those, but since they will all disagree with all of the others, I'm confident of being in a majority for any given such statement. Nobody can agree. The other one is not popularly thought to be a problem, but it is gaining some traction. And there is a small group of philosophers, among them me, who does think this is a problem. The problem is that we select certain events and call them causes at the expense of others. I say striking the match causes it to light. Okay, when we do fire training or whatever, we learn there's a triangle: oxygen, heat, and fuel. You need all three. To stop a fire, you take away one or other of these. True, but there are many other things as well that you need for any given fire. So I strike the match, but the reason I'm striking the match is to light a candle, and that's because, ESCOM did their thing, and we've got load shedding, and it's dark, and I don't have lights, so I'm trying to light a candle. It's to do with the fact as well that I can't sleep. I'm up in the middle of the night, and that's to do with the fact that there's some email I forgot to answer, and that's to do with the fact that blah-de-blah-de-blah. Ultimately, my mother has some significant part in this because she gave birth to me, and if I hadn't been born, I wouldn't be trying to light this, and all the way back to the Big Bang. And we don't. That's not. It doesn't. We don't normally say, no matter how hard philosophers try to pretend that we do, we don't say, Mrs. Broadbent Senior caused the match to light. We just don't. Mrs. Broadbent Senior giving birth to baby Alex caused the match to light. That's just not. That's just not what we say. And philosophers have just set this aside for various reasons, which I don't want to be too dismissive about. But increasingly, the more practically minded people involved in causation, in thinking about causation, they want to model the way we normally think about causation. That's what they want to do. So this is a problem for anybody who wants to do that, particularly who wants to understand how we predict and understand and explain, and how we place blame and hold people responsible legally, because all of those things depend on this feature of our causal thinking. And counterfactuals don't handle it because for all of these things, the effect counterfactually depends upon them, and yet we don't normally think of them all as causes, or at least not all at the same time. It seems to be context dependent. So there are things that haven't been captured counterfactually with counterfactual mathematization. Being a doctor requires causal thinking. So this is because of two things. Firstly, to understand why things happen, to give an explanation of why things are happening, you need causal thinking for at least certain sorts of explanations, typically ones of why this happened rather than that. So why did the train crash at Montparnasse rather than Gare du Nord? Because it was routed to Montparnasse. Why did it crash rather than arrive safely and stop within the station? Because the brakes failed. But you need the notion of causation to provide any such explanation. It's also because doctors, when they're trying to do something, they need to know what's going to happen. But they need to know not just the probability of a certain event happening given a prior event. They need to know the probability of that event happening given that you do the prior event. And that's a different probability. It may be a different probability. So the probability of a person, for example, losing or having a certain body mass index given that they exercise a lot may be different from the probability of them having that same body mass index given that you do the exercise, you make them exercise. Because somebody who, for example, who exercises a lot may also be inclined to eat well. They may be wealthier, which is also positively correlated with health, and so forth. Whereas the person who's been put into a randomized control and just told to exercise may not have any of those features. So that's an example of a case in which you have a difference between an intervention, the probability dependent on intervention, the probability of just should you encounter that data. And you need to think causally in order to understand, to predict. But not just to predict what will happen, but to predict what would happen. Because if you're not predicting what would happen given a certain intervention, then you're not able to truly manipulate, to truly intervene. That is, to do something with the goal of bringing about one outcome rather than another. And it follows the doctors can't be robots. QED means quod ed demonstratum. It's what mathematicians and pompous people say when they think they've proved something. So there's an objection here, which is that, and this is, I mean, look, this is not stuff this is stuff, I don't know, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, it's not stuff that I've thought through properly, but I think it's interesting. So one fine day, robots will or might be doctors. This is just the idea that this optimism might be okay. There might be a cognitive algorithm for causation, and it might be uncovered, or some algorithm may emulate causal behavior. So suppose there is some cognitive algorithm for causation, or at least for counterfactual thinking as it relates to causal thinking. The trouble is there isn't necessarily such an algorithm. We don't use algorithms for all of our thoughts, including all of our thoughts that could be modeled by an algorithm. So catching a ball. Does anybody know what process goes on in our mind to catch a ball? Which is, I mean, it can be modeled, it's a computational task. You estimate the velocity, you could estimate the velocity based on the trajectory and so forth. Does anybody know what we actually do? We don't do any of that. We don't estimate the trajectory and then calculate the likely landing position given the parabola we think it's going to, so forth. That's not what we do. We just keep it in the same spot in our visual field. And if you keep a moving object in the same spot in your visual field, you'll gradually end up in the same place as it. Much easier, quicker. No computation at all. So, but you can model that with an algorithm, but that's not what we actually do. So there's no guarantee that there is an algorithm that we use to do causal thinking or causal reasoning. So even if you do like neuroscience and you see what's going on in the brain, we might not actually discover how to implement that. It might be some kind of a shortcut. Could we emulate causal reasoning? I don't think so, and there's two ideas I have here. One is from Judea Pearl. He points out or argues that machine learning is not transferable. So machine learning, he says, can't get beyond data. So he gives the example of somebody who learns, for example, the effect of an intervention, medical intervention in a certain hospital, compared to a machine that develops an algorithm for making the same prediction. The machine, if they go to a different hospital where people have different lifestyles, different incomes, different distribution of ages, and so forth, that machine will have to learn a whole new algorithm for that new data. But if somebody has understood the causal structure of that first situation, they don't have to learn a whole new algorithm. They need the new data, but they plug it into their existing, they might know, for example, the way that age affects the outcome of giving a certain drug. So the fact they move to a population where there's more old people doesn't really faze them. They understand what's going on. They just have to consider the fact that more of their patients are old. And let's think the same goes one level up. So even if you could emulate causal reasoning, you could emulate behavior based on causal reasoning in one situation, you could build a robot that did exactly what a doctor does in that hospital. That robot wouldn't be able to do exactly what that doctor would do in another hospital. So I think it goes up the levels. The other idea I have relates to Chomsky's idea of the poverty of the stimulus in relation to language. Noam Chomsky argued famously that there's just nowhere near enough data for children to learn language if they are blank slates. This relates also to sort of political ideas and old debates between rationalists and empiricists, to what extent, nature or nurture. And Chomsky argues that at least when it comes to language, a lot of it is nature, because there's just not enough exposure to words and to the use of language for children to learn it, unless they already have some kind of language module in their mind, and then it's just a matter of basically slotting in the particular language you happen to have into those modules. That's his argument, and it's quite a compelling one, I think. Hume argues that the data underdetermine causal statements. So Hume says, look, given all these associations, you can't infer causal claims. You can't deduce causal claims. And Chomsky argues for this language module. And I think if you combine those two ideas, you could get something like, well, regularities provide an inadequate stimulus for learning causation. And that makes it different from some of the great success stories of machine learning. AlphaZero, I think it's called AlphaZero, is this Google built this computer that learned chess in 4 hours and then beat the best chess computers, purpose-built chess computers. And that's a demonstration of the power of machine learning. But arguably, in that context, this kind of underdetermination doesn't matter. It's a rule-governed activity. You don't have to. You fundamentally, it's a deductive system. Chess is a deductive system. So it's about working out consequences of doing certain things given certain rules. And causation fundamentally does not provide us with a deductive system. Could there be causal zombies? Couldn't there be things, this is the same idea put a different way really. Couldn't there be things which are just like us in their behavior, but it's dark inside? This is borrowed from the philosophy of mind, where David Chalmers talks about zombies who do exactly what we do, but they're not conscious. Couldn't there be such things? I don't think so. I think that to behave as if you were reasoning counterfactually, and I know I'm switching between causation and counterfactual here. I'm talking about the counterfactual notion of causation. I think that just is to reason counterfactually. I don't think there's any difference between behaving counterfactually and reasoning counterfactually. That might sound odd, but I think that the as if implies that counterfactual behavior is included, that how you would behave is included. To behave as if you were reasoning counterfactually isn't just to actually behave as if you were reasoning counterfactually. It includes what you would have done. If that's correct, that means that you can't emulate counterfactual behavior. There's just too much of it. So you can't have something that acts as if it were reasoning counterfactually. That's the thought, anyway. And finally, there are certain things doctors can do that robots can't. So, as I said, doctors can understand. The notions of causation and understanding are very tightly linked. They both concern the contrast between things being one way rather than another. The notion of making a difference. That's the counterfactual notion of causation. And if you merely associate, you're not going to be able to understand. Most animals merely associate. They can't contrast how things are with how things would be, and to that extent they don't understand. And then that means you can't predict under new circumstances, and if you can't predict under new circumstances, you can't justifiably claim that what you do is a manipulation or an intervention in the way that we usually mean those terms. And finally, this is an allusion to my work on medicine. I don't think you can have understanding. I don't think you can have medicine without understanding. That's because medicine needs a kind of second prize after cure because it's so bad at cure. If you look at the history of medicine in all different parts of the world, it's been dramatically, remarkably, incredibly ineffective, and yet it's persisted. And why is that? Given that it's not curing, in my view, it must be because what it's doing, what people are wanting from it, is something else. Yes, they want cure, but they'll accept something else. And what that is, I think, is some degree of understanding, or at least engaging with the effort to understand. you know, and you can see this. You would want to know if you have an incurable disease. Many people do want to know if they have an incurable disease, even if there's nothing you can do about it. I've got a lot more to say about that. I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say it here. That's it. Thank you very much.